Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Mark walked the streets of the city, the rain still coming down heavily, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and uncertainty. He had never imagined himself in a situation like this. A stranger offering him an out, a way to clear the debts that had weighed on him since his father's death. He kept replaying Eleanor's words in his head, her calm, commanding voice, the offer of marriage not for love, but as a business arrangement. "Marry me," she had said, "and I'll pay off your debts." Mark didn't know what to think. It seemed too good to be true, yet he couldn't deny the desperation creeping in. It was a lifeline, but at what cost? He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it clung to him, heavy, like the damp jacket clinging to his shoulders. As he passed by a small coffee shop, he stopped in his tracks. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another message from his mother. "Have you heard back from the bank yet?" she had asked, the uncertainty in her words echoing his own. Mark took a deep breath and dialed her number. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice strained. "Not yet. But I have a meeting later tonight. I'll keep you updated." She sighed, her voice soft but worried. "I know you're doing your best, Mark. I'm just scared." His heart ached hearing the fear in her voice. He promised her it would be okay, even though he wasn't sure himself. Hanging up, Mark found himself standing in front of the same bistro where he had met Eleanor just hours ago. He didn't even remember walking here, but it felt like fate, like he was being drawn to this place for a reason. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. Eleanor was already seated, her silver hair gleaming under the soft restaurant lights. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Davis," she greeted him, her voice steady. "Have you made a decision?" Mark stood there for a moment, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I've thought about it," he said, finally finding his voice. "I'll do it." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Good. We'll begin immediately." She handed him a folder, and Mark took it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a detailed contract, outlining the terms of their arrangement. The stipulations were clear: no love, no emotional involvement, just a business partnership. It was an arrangement Mark could hardly believe he was agreeing to. He looked at Eleanor, unsure what to feel. Was this the right decision? Could he really go through with it? But the reality of his situation was undeniable. He had no other options. He signed the papers, the pen moving across the page like it had a mind of its own. Eleanor didn't waste any time. "We begin tomorrow," she said, standing up and smoothing her suit. "I'll have my lawyer finalize everything. You'll move into my estate by the end of the week." Mark's head was spinning. He had just agreed to marry a woman he barely knew, a woman who was decades older than him, and for what? Money? Security? He didn't even know anymore. Eleanor's presence was calm, almost soothing, as she guided him out of the bistro. "You'll be well taken care of, Mr. Davis," she said, her tone final. "This is the best thing for both of us." Mark nodded, still in shock, but something in her words resonated with him. He wasn't just signing up for Adele, was stepping into a new life, one where he no longer had to worry about the weight of his family's debts. For a moment, he felt like he was being rescued. But as he followed her into the waiting car, a feeling of unease settled deep in his stomach. What had he just agreed to? And what would his life look like now? The next few days felt like a blur for Mark. His life had completely shifted in a matter of hours. One moment, he was just a law student struggling to make ends meet, and the next, he was on the verge of marrying a woman he barely knew, Eleanor Brooks, a billionaire CEO, much older than him, offering him a lifeline in exchange for his name and presence. As promised, he moved into Eleanor's estate by the end of the week. The mansion was even more impressive than he had imagined: towering columns, marble floors, chandeliers that seemed to glow with an almost otherworldly light. It was a world of luxury he had never been a part of, a world that seemed to mock his past struggle. Mark spent the first few days in a daze, unsure of how to navigate his new life. Eleanor had arranged everything: a room for him in the guest wing, a private office for his personal use, and even a car service to take him anywhere he needed. It felt like he was living in a dream. He still hadn't fully grasped the reality of what he had agreed to, but he was beginning to wonder if he could find a way to make peace with it. He had been given a chance at financial security, at stability, something he had never known. But the price was his independence, and he was starting to feel the weight of that loss. One afternoon, Eleanor asked him to join her at a charity gala she was hosting. "You need to start adjusting to the public eye, Mark," she said, as she handed him a perfectly tailored suit for the event. "We're a couple now, even if it's just for show. People will talk, and you need to know how to handle the attention." Mark nodded, his stomach tightening. He had never been comfortable in the spotlight, and this was a level of attention he was unprepared for. As they arrived at the gala, he couldn't help but feel out of place. The other guests were all powerful, influential people, their conversations filled with talk of business deals, luxury cars, and exclusive vacations. And then there was Mark, just a young man who had agreed to marry a woman he didn't love, all for the sake of money and security. As he stood by Eleanor's side, he felt the eyes of the crowd on him. Some were curious, others judgmental, but no one questioned Eleanor. She was the star of the night, the woman everyone wanted to impress. Mark, on the other hand, was just her arm candy, a means to an end. But as the evening wore on, he began to notice something strange. Eleanor seemed to be watching him with a level of interest that he hadn't expected. Whenever they spoke, she listened intently, her gaze lingering on him in a way that made him uncomfortable. At one point, as they stood together near the balcony, Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice low. "I know this must feel strange for you," she said, her tone softer than usual. "But I'm not as cold as I seem, Mark. I didn't want to put you in this position, but I thought this was the only way." Mark turned to her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. He had expected her to be aloof, focused only on the business side of their arrangement. But there was something more to her, something he hadn't seen before. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes distant for a moment. "Because you're different. You don't see me as just a rich woman. You don't want anything from me, except a way out. That's why I trusted you." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so focused on his own needs and struggles that he hadn't considered Eleanor's reasons for making the offer. She wasn't just some powerful CEO offering a transaction. She was a woman who had been lonely, who had wanted something real, even if it was just for the sake of appearances. Mark found himself at a crossroads. The woman standing beside him was not just the businesswoman he had imagined. She had feelings, desires, and a side of her that was as vulnerable as his own. The evening continued, but Mark's mind was elsewhere, lost in the complexity of what Eleanor had just shared. Could he see her as more than just a lifeline? Could he open his heart to her, even in this fake marriage? As the night wore on, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement could lead to something more than either of them had expected. The following days after the gala felt like a blur to Mark. He was still processing everything that had happened, still unsure about the choices he had made. It was as though he had stepped into a new world, one filled with wealth, power, and luxury, but it was a world that didn't quite fit him. He spent his days at Eleanor's estate, getting used to the lavish surroundings. The grand halls, the endless rooms, and the staff that moved quietly in the background, catering to his every need. But it all felt strangely empty. He was living in a mansion, yet he felt more alone than ever. Eleanor had insisted that he take part in a series of events, meetings, and gatherings to make him more comfortable in this new life. But the more time Mark spent in her world, the more he realized how much he didn't belong. He wasn't used to this type of attention, the constant eyes on him, the whispered conversations when he entered the room. It was all overwhelming. One evening, Eleanor asked him to accompany her to another event, a business dinner this time. It was a formal gathering of some of her most important clients and business partners. "You need to be there, Mark," she told him as they stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. "This is more than just about appearances. I want them to see us as a united front. It's important." Mark hesitated, feeling the weight of the situation. "What if I'm not good at this? What if I make a fool of myself?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Eleanor looked at him with a soft smile. "You'll do fine. Just be yourself." But Mark wasn't sure who he was supposed to be anymore. Was he still the law student from the city, or had he become someone else, someone defined by his connection to Eleanor? As they arrived at the event, Mark immediately felt out of place. The room was filled with people who had more money, more power, and more connections than he could ever dream of. They spoke in terms he didn't understand, about deals he wasn't a part of. And then there was Eleanor, standing tall, her presence commanding the room. She was confident, poised, and in control. Mark, on the other hand, felt like a shadow beside her. Throughout the night, he struggled to find his place, standing awkwardly by her side, trying to keep up with conversations, all while pretending that he wasn't out of his depth. But then something unexpected happened. As the evening progressed, one of the guests, a wealthy businessman who seemed particularly interested in Eleanor, approached them. "I hear you've been busy with some new ventures, Eleanor," the man said smoothly, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made Mark uncomfortable. "What about your husband?" he asked, turning his attention to Mark. Mark wasn't sure how to respond. "He's adjusting to the lifestyle," Eleanor answered before he could speak, her voice calm and assured. "We're still getting used to all of this." The way she spoke about their relationship was so natural, so seamless, as though the contract they had was nothing more than a formality. And yet, for Mark, it felt like everything was real. In that moment, something shifted inside him. He realized that he had already been sucked into this world, that he had already allowed himself to become a part of Eleanor's life in a way he hadn't expected. As the night went on, Mark found himself drawn into deeper conversations with some of the guests. He was no longer just standing there in the background, trying to fit in. For the first time, he felt like he was becoming part of something bigger. By the time the dinner ended, Mark was exhausted but strangely exhilarated. As they left the event, Eleanor turned to him with a knowing smile. "You did well tonight," she said. "You're getting the hang of it." Mark wasn't sure if he was getting the hang of it, or if he was simply pretending to. But one thing was clear: was beginning to feel more connected to Eleanor than ever before. Maybe this arrangement, this marriage for convenience, could turn into something more. Maybe he wasn't just her contract husband anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he was becoming a real part of her world. The next few weeks passed in a haze for Mark. He was slowly getting used to the life he had stepped into, but it wasn't as easy as he had hoped. The events, the meetings, the constant socializing, everything felt like a game he didn't quite understand. But Eleanor had made it clear that this was part of the deal. He had to play the role, show up at her side, and blend into the world of the rich and powerful. Eleanor was, as always, calm and composed, a woman in control of everything. But Mark began to notice something more, something beneath the surface. She was careful with him, always considerate, but there were moments when she seemed to look at him with a vulnerability that he hadn't expected. It wasn't much, but he started to see it, an almost imperceptible shift in her expression when she thought he wasn't paying attention. One evening, as they sat together at dinner in the grand dining room, Eleanor spoke softly, as if hesitant to break the silence. "You're doing well," she said, her voice gentle. Mark looked up from his plate, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. I'm trying to keep up," he replied, though his words lacked confidence. He still wasn't sure where he fit in this life, but Eleanor had made him feel like he was slowly becoming part of something bigger. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You know, Mark, this arrangement doesn't just benefit you. It's helping me too." Mark furrowed his brow. "How's that?" he asked. She took a deep breath before answering, as though carefully choosing her words. I've spent my life building this empire. But I've always been alone. I thought I could manage it all on my own, but I was wrong. She paused, her gaze flickering away for a moment before returning to him. This partnership is something I never thought I needed. But now that it's here, I realize how much it's changed things for me. Her words hung in the air, and Mark found himself unsure of how to respond. He had never expected to hear such vulnerability from her. Eleanor, the powerful CEO, was someone he had seen as untouchable, someone who didn't need anyone. But now, she was opening up in a way he hadn't anticipated. I'm glad it's working out, Mark said quietly. I never thought I'd be in this situation, but I guess it's a lot better than the alternative. Eleanor smiled faintly, a soft, almost sad smile. I know it's not ideal for either of us, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I think we're both finding something we didn't expect. The conversation lingered in Mark's mind long after dinner ended. Eleanor's words had struck a chord in him. She wasn't just his wife in name anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had saved him from his financial troubles. She was someone who was genuinely starting to care about him. And he was beginning to feel the same. As the days passed, Mark started to notice the little things: how Eleanor would make small gestures of kindness, how she would check in on him after a long day, asking if he was okay. It was subtle, but it was there, and Mark couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something more. One evening, after a long day of meetings and events, Eleanor asked him to join her for a walk in the garden. I thought we could get some fresh air, she said, her voice soft and inviting. Mark agreed, not knowing what to expect. As they walked together under the stars, the tension between them seemed to melt away. It was just the two of them, in the quiet of the night, away from the prying eyes of the world. For the first time, Mark felt like they were just two people, not a CEO and her contract husband. They were simply together. Mark, Eleanor said, breaking the silence, I know this marriage was supposed to be just for business, but I think it's turning into something else. Something real. Mark stopped walking, turning to face her. Are you saying you feel the same? He asked, his heart racing. She met his gaze, her eyes soft but certain. I think I do, she replied. And I think you do too. Mark's chest tightened. He hadn't allowed himself to believe it, but now, with her standing in front of him, he realized that he had started to care for her. This marriage, this arrangement, they had both slowly turned it into something more than just a contract. Maybe this was the beginning of something he hadn't expected. Something real. The days following their walk in the garden were filled with a new sense of tension for Mark. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, I think it's turning into something else. Something real. He had tried to brush it off at first, telling himself that this was all just part of the arrangement. But as the days went on, he realized he couldn't ignore the feelings that had begun to stir inside him. Eleanor had been nothing but kind to him, and in return, he had grown to admire her more than he had ever expected. It wasn't just the security she had provided him, nor was it just the lavish lifestyle he had gotten used to. It was her strength, her vulnerability, and the way she had started to trust him, to open up in ways he hadn't thought possible. Still, Mark struggled to accept what he was feeling. He had come into this marriage expecting nothing more than a contract, a means to solve his problems. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. He was beginning to care for Eleanor, and the idea of it made him feel conflicted. Could he truly love someone like her? Could this arrangement lead to something more? Eleanor, for her part, seemed to be navigating the same internal struggle. She was still the powerful CEO everyone admired, but in moments of quiet, when they were alone, she seemed different, gentler, more vulnerable. She had begun to share pieces of herself with him, small glimpses of the woman behind the empire she had built. And as much as Mark tried to ignore it, he couldn't help but wonder if he had already fallen for her. One evening, after a long week of business meetings and charity events, Eleanor invited Mark to dinner in one of the estate's intimate dining rooms. The table was set for two, the soft glow of candlelight flickering in the dim room. As they sat down, Mark could feel the tension in the air. The conversation flowed easily at first, casual talk about their day, but then Eleanor grew quiet, her eyes studying him in a way that made him feel like she was waiting for something. Finally, she spoke. "Mark, I've been thinking about us." She paused, as if trying to find the right words. This isn't what I planned. When we first made this arrangement, I never thought it would turn into something more. But now, I'm not so sure." Mark felt his heart skip a beat. This was it. She was finally acknowledging what they both had been avoiding. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I didn't expect any of this either. But I'm starting to feel like this isn't just a business deal anymore." He paused, searching her face for any sign of what she was thinking. "I care about you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "I care about you too, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think I have for a while now." Her admission took him by surprise, but in a way, it also brought a sense of relief. It felt like the weight of their unspoken feelings had finally been lifted. They both sat there, in silence, letting the moment sink in. For the first time, they were not just two people bound by a contract, but two people who had come to care deeply for each other. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Mark couldn't stop thinking about what Eleanor had said. She cared about him. And he cared about her. Maybe, just maybe, this arrangement could turn into something real. After dinner, as they walked together through the quiet halls of the estate, Mark felt a new sense of hope. He didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance at something more than just a contract. Maybe love wasn't as impossible as he had once thought. Maybe it was already there, growing quietly between them, waiting to be recognized. Eleanor stopped at the foot of the stairs, turning to face him. "I think we've both come a long way," she said, her voice warm. "But there's still so much to explore, together." Mark smiled, feeling a surge of emotion. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the next step would be. But one thing was certain: this was no longer just a business arrangement. It was the beginning of something that felt more like love than he had ever expected. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Days turned into weeks, and Mark found himself falling deeper into the unexpected rhythm of his life with Eleanor. What had started as a contractual agreement, a mere business arrangement, had transformed into something far more complex and real than either of them had anticipated. Their connection had grown beyond surface-level conversations and forced smiles at public events. It had become genuine. But with this new closeness, new complications began to surface. Mark's feelings for Eleanor were undeniable, yet he found himself battling with uncertainty. Was this love? Or was he simply caught up in the comfort and security she had given him? He had started this marriage with no expectations of affection, but now, the lines were blurred. Eleanor seemed to sense his growing hesitation. She had become more affectionate, more open, and in turn, Mark felt a pressure building inside him to be equally vulnerable. One evening, Eleanor invited Mark to join her at a private gathering, a small dinner with a few close business associates. It wasn't the extravagant events they were used to, but a quiet, intimate affair. Mark appreciated the simplicity, even if it meant another evening spent in the company of people he barely knew. As the night wore on, Eleanor seemed unusually quiet, more distant than usual. Mark watched her closely, sensing a change in her demeanor. They were sitting together at the table, but she seemed lost in thought, her gaze far away. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" Mark asked gently, his voice laced with concern. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't heard him. For a moment, her eyes softened, and then her guard seemed to slip away. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said, her voice low. "About this arrangement." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, but hearing her bring it up now, in such an intimate setting, caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. Eleanor hesitated before speaking again, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. At first, I didn't expect anything to change. I thought this would just be a way to fix things, but now," she paused, looking up at him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite read. "Now, I realize it's not that simple." Mark took a deep breath. The tension that had been building between them was finally coming to the surface. "Eleanor, if you're saying what I think you're saying." "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to care about you like this. But I do. I care about you more than I ever thought possible." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Eleanor's gaze softened as she reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "I know," she said quietly. "I think I've been afraid of it. Afraid of what this could mean. I never wanted to depend on anyone, especially not on you. But now I'm starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, I've been wrong." Mark felt his heart swell with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but it also scared him. What would this mean for their future? What would it mean for their arrangement? "Eleanor, I never came into this with expectations," Mark said, his voice steady. "But I'm starting to realize that this, whatever it is between us, it's not just a contract anymore. It's something real." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I think we've both known that for a while now." The conversation lingered in the air between them, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Neither of them knew what the future held, but in that moment, they both realized that their lives had intertwined in a way that couldn't be undone. Mark had started this marriage with nothing but a sense of survival, a way to escape his financial struggles. But now, he realized he had found something much deeper, a connection with a woman he had never expected to care for, a bond that was becoming more than just a survival tactic. As they left the dinner together, walking through the quiet garden of the estate, Eleanor's hand in his felt like the final piece to a puzzle he had never known he was putting together. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But for the first time, Mark felt like he was no longer just playing a role. He was part of something real, something that went beyond a simple contract. And as he looked at Eleanor, he knew that his life had changed forever. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of unease and anticipation for Mark. He had crossed a line he hadn't expected to, and now, the reality of what he was feeling for Eleanor hit him with full force. It was no longer just a marriage for convenience, it had become something far more complex. He had started to fall in love with her, and the weight of that realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Eleanor had been nothing but kind to him, but it wasn't just kindness anymore. There was a tenderness in her eyes, a warmth in her touch that told him she felt the same way. Yet, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship was still built on a shaky foundation. It had started as a contract, nothing more than a business deal, but now, they were both navigating uncharted territory. And Mark didn't know what would happen if things went wrong. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of Eleanor's estate, the quiet of the night settled around them. Mark couldn't help but feel the tension between them, an unspoken connection that had been growing since their last conversation. Eleanor turned to him, her gaze soft. "Mark," she began, her voice low, "I think it's time we have a serious conversation." Mark looked at her, his heart skipping a beat. He had feared this moment, knowing that their growing feelings couldn't be ignored forever. "About what?" he asked, his voice steady, though he felt the uncertainty gnawing at him. Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes focused on the stars above. "About us," she said. "About what this is becoming." Mark's pulse quickened. He knew what she was about to say, but hearing it aloud made everything feel more real. "I don't want to be just a contract anymore, Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I want something real with you. I think I already have something real with you." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if she was surprised by his words, but she quickly regained her composure. "I feel the same way," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But I don't know what that means for us. We've built this life together, but it was never supposed to be more than an arrangement." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "We can make it more," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "We've already started to make it more." There was a long pause, and Mark could see the wheels turning in Eleanor's mind. He knew she was just as conflicted as he was. The life they had built together was based on a contract, and breaking that contract would change everything. "What if we get hurt?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if this isn't real, and we ruin everything?" Mark squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I don't think we'll know unless we take the chance," he said. "But I'm willing to take that chance with you, Eleanor. I'm willing to see where this goes." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth. After a long moment, she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "All right," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Let's take that chance." In that moment, everything changed. The contract, the business arrangement, they no longer mattered. What mattered was the connection they had formed, the bond they had built, and the love that was beginning to bloom between them. Mark realized that he was no longer just her contract husband, no longer just the man who had been rescued from his financial struggles. He was someone who was genuinely loved, someone who was building a future with the woman who had once been his lifeline. As they stood there together, under the stars, Mark knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor's relationship grew deeper, their connection stronger with each passing moment. What had started as an unexpected business arrangement had blossomed into something neither of them had expected, something real. They had crossed a line they could not uncross, but for the first time, they both felt certain that it was the right choice. The bond they shared was no longer based on convenience or survival, it was based on trust, vulnerability, and love. Eleanor had opened herself to him in ways she hadn't allowed anyone else, and Mark, despite his initial fears, had found himself falling for her in a way he never thought possible. They had begun to navigate the complexities of their relationship together, learning how to balance the life they had built with the emotions they had started to feel. Eleanor, once a woman of control, had found someone who could stand beside her without fear, and Mark, once the man who needed rescuing, had become a partner in a way he never expected. But life, as it often does, threw them a curveball. Eleanor's business rivals, who had always kept their distance, started taking a more aggressive interest in her personal life, questioning her decisions, even her marriage. It wasn't just about the business anymore, it was about undermining everything she had worked so hard to build. One day, as they sat together in the study, Eleanor spoke of the pressure she was feeling. "They don't understand, Mark," she said, her voice tense with frustration. "They think I'm weak, that this marriage, this partnership, is a sign of something. I don't know, unprofessional. They want me to be the cold, heartless woman they think I should be, but I'm not. Not anymore." Mark reached out, his hand gently touching hers. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he said softly. "You've built this empire on your own, Eleanor. This marriage, our partnership, it doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. You've shown everyone that you can have it all." Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read the truth of his words. She had always been the one in control, but now, she allowed herself to lean on him, just as he had leaned on her. "I don't know what I would do without you," she whispered. Mark smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. He had come into this marriage with nothing but his worries, and now, he had everything he had ever needed. The woman he had once thought would be out of his reach, someone who had saved him, had become his equal, his partner. And he knew, with certainty, that this was no longer just a marriage of convenience. It was a true partnership, one built on love, trust, and mutual respect. The next day, they attended a charity gala together, an event that had once felt like just another obligation. But this time, as they walked into the ballroom hand in hand, it felt different. Mark felt a sense of pride that he hadn't experienced before, not just because of the luxury surrounding them, but because of the woman at his side. She was no longer just the CEO, the woman who had saved him from financial ruin. She was his wife, his partner, and someone he deeply loved. As they stood together in the center of the room, Eleanor turned to him, a soft smile playing on her lips. I think we've come a long way, she said, her voice warm. Mark nodded, his heart swelling. We have, he replied. And I can't wait to see where we go from here. They shared a quiet, intimate moment amidst the bustling crowd, knowing that they had not only survived the challenges life had thrown at them, but had also found something beautiful in the process. Their love story, born from an unexpected contract, had grown into a true partnership, one that neither of them could have anticipated. And for the first time, Mark knew that the future was theirs to shape, together.